A 1967 Marcos GT. It was designed by the Adams brothers in 1962. It's from the Marcos factory in England. Marcos was a manufacturer. The name comes from the two owners and developers of the car. The MAR is a gentleman named Jem Marsh, and Jem was a woodworker and a race car driver. And the COS is Frank Costin, who was a famous aerodynamicist and engineer. And one of the projects he worked on during the war was the de Havilland Mosquito wooden bomber of World War II, which was the Allies' greatest bomber, and today it's considered the third greatest bomber ever made. And it was all made of wood because during that time of the war, the Allies didn't have resources for making steel, and so they turned to wood, and wood was an easy commodity to get, and they ended up designing pieces of the Mosquito that could be sent out to wood shops all over the world, to all the Allies, and the Allies would make pieces of the Mosquito, send it to England, to the de Havilland factory, and they were assembled there. So Frank Costin took his love of wood and the lightweight and strength of wood and took that racing and developed it in the chassis of his cars. The Marcos was first penned in 1959, and they were made from 59 through 2007. In 1959 through 1969, all the cars had wooden chassis. They were the only wooden monocoque chassis in the world, which they had 283 pieces of aviation grade plywood, which was mahogany and balsa plywood with spruce stiffeners, held together with a glue called aerolite, which was the epoxy of its time, and they were stapled together with aerolite. So the entire chassis was made of wood, and it's very lightweight, very strong, and the body's made of fiberglass, and the fiberglass was totally bonded to the wood chassis. Cars were primarily made for the racetrack, and the first couple cars made were pretty ugly. They were called the Ugly Duckling. After that, in 1962, they came out with a Gullwing. And the Gullwings were very successful race cars because they were very lightweight and very strong, so didn't require much engine to push them along pretty quick. Most of the early cars had Cosworth race engines in them, Cosworth Ford engines. The COS in Cosworth was Mike Costin, who was Frank Costin's brother. Anyway, the second Marcos ever made was driven by one Jackie Stewart, one of the greatest race car drivers of all time. Jackie Ickx was also a Marcos driver, and a number of other pretty famous race drivers had driven Marcos in their early years. This design, pretty much of this particular body style, came around in 1963. It got a little wider and a little longer, and a few shapes to the different changes in flaring around the wheel wells and a little bit air dam difference and stuff. But this basic body style in both a convertible and a coupe was pretty much around till early 1990s. Like I said, the wooden chassis, of which this is one, the wooden chassis cars were made up until 1969. They just became too labor intensive to build with all the pieces put together. They were put together in the de Havilland factory, but to cut and shape and glue and staple all the pieces together took 2 weeks to make a chassis. So they went to steel chassis in '69, where they could make them a lot quicker, a lot less labor intensive, so they cost a lot less to make. The engines range from, some of the early engines were some early 997 BMC blocks, to later in 1984 they put a Rover V8, all aluminum V8 in the chassis, in the steel chassis, and they went on from there. Later in the 90s, they went to a Ford V8 and also a Ford V6 power, and then went to a Corvette engines in the 2000s. Some of the early cars also from '63, Ford 5 had Volvo engines in them, Volvo straight 4 P1800 engine, B18, and then later went to the Formula Ford crossflow engine, which this is an example of the crossflow. But if you follow the front end of the car, you see some steel here. This is the only steel in the suspension carrier that's on the car, and it bolts directly to wood. These are a series of triangulated wood box beams that go all the way through the car, from the front of the car all the way to the rear of the car. The suspension is bolted directly to the wood, the rear suspension is bolted directly to the wood, and the body is, for strength, is a series of triangulated box beams through the center where the propeller shaft is. There's a bulkhead in this area here. There's a box beam that runs along the door sill. Behind the passenger seat, there's a box beam, another box or a bulkhead, and a bulkhead here, both in front and behind the wheel, and then finishing up at the back of the car, at the tail end of the car, into a triangulated box beam here, where this is all wood, and you can see the suspension is bolted right up to the wood, and with some rubber bushings. The rear suspension, and they, a lot of these, because the factory was very small, there were only less than 200 of the wooden chassis that were made, and there are not many left in North America that are wood chassis. About 8 that are on the road currently, and about 80 Marcos in North America, and there's about 100 wooden chassis that are left in the world right now.